There was a village nestled deep in the cradle of ancient forests and winding rivers, a place so hidden from the outside world that many believed it was guarded by the spirits of the earth itself. This was the village of Whispering Winds, named so because on quiet nights, the breeze would weave through the trees and carry the voices of the past, laughter, weeping, warnings, through the sleeping huts and dusty footpaths. It was said that even the dead spoke through the wind, and wise villagers listened carefully, for the winds often knew truths that men refused to see. The village of Whispering Winds was a place of tradition, where every stone, every gnarled tree root, and every clay hut held the weight of centuries. Here, elders sat beneath the shade of the great baobab tree, dispensing wisdom and punishment alike. The river that curled along the village's edge was believed to be the lifeblood of their ancestors, and every child was taught to greet it each morning with a splash and a song. Drums beat like the village's heart during festivals, and storytellers, griots, roamed from hearth to hearth, keeping alive the tales of heroes, spirits and monsters. To outsiders, it might have seemed a place of peace, untouched by time, unmarred by the chaos of distant kingdoms and sprawling cities. Yet beneath the woven thatch roofs and behind the warm smiles, darker things took root. In this village, as in many places untouched by change, traditions could be both a shield and a weapon. It was tradition that bound families together in celebration, but it was also tradition that sometimes hid cruelty behind closed doors. Wives bore bruises beneath bright dresses. Children learned early which silences were safest. And the winds, ever restless, carried their secrets from one end of the forest to the other. There was an old saying whispered among the women as they pounded maize or fetched water from the river: "The wind hears the cries no one else dares to speak." It was not just a proverb, it was a truth that ran deeper than the roots of the oldest trees. For in the village of Whispering Winds, some pains were invisible not because they were small, but because everyone had agreed, silently, shamefully, to look away. Among these hidden sorrows, there lived a girl whose story would one day shake the village to its very bones. Her name was Laya, though few spoke it aloud. She moved like a shadow, slipping between huts and market stalls, her presence so quiet that many barely noticed her at all. But those who looked closely, truly looked, would have seen the fire that flickered in her dark eyes, banked low but unextinguished. She was the daughter of a woman who had once been known for her laughter, a woman whose spirit had been broken by sickness and sorrow. When Lila's mother died, the village mourned politely, but life in the village of Whispering Winds was a river that could not be dammed for long. It moved forward, carrying Lila along with it into a future she did not choose. Her father remarried quickly as tradition demanded, taking a woman from another clan, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes. With the new marriage came a new boy into their home, a stepbrother named Cain. To the village, this blending of families was a cause for celebration. The drums beat loud and the fires burned high. No one paid attention to the girl with the quiet eyes standing stiffly at the edge of the gathering. If they had listened more closely to the wind that night, they might have heard the warning sigh it gave as it threaded through the trees. But the people of the village were tired of omens. They wanted only good news, only songs of harvest and children and weddings. They were tired of worrying about what lay hidden in the folds of everyday life. And so, they closed their ears to the whispers in the wind, and to the silent scream of a girl who had already begun to drift beyond their reach. Lila's story was not yet a song then. It was just a shadow moving through sunlight, a tear lost in the river's roar, a matchstick flickering against a great and terrible night. But soon, very soon, her story would blaze through the village like a wildfire, leaving no heart untouched, no secret safe. In the village of Whispering Winds, change was a slow and dangerous thing. Yet sometimes all it took was one spark, one girl, to set a whole world ablaze. And the wind, ever faithful, would carry her story far beyond the forests and rivers, across mountains and deserts, until even the stars would whisper her name. On the night Lila was born, a weeping star crossed the heavens. It blazed a brilliant silver trail across the indigo sky, so bright that even the elders, hardened by years of toil and grief, paused to watch in awe. Some said it was a blessing, a rare sign from the ancestors that a special child had arrived. Others, more cautious, whispered among themselves that a weeping star was a warning, for where great light appeared, great sorrow often followed. In the village of Whispering Winds, signs were not taken lightly. They were woven into the fabric of daily life, heavier than the thick blankets draped over their sleeping forms. Thus, from her very first breath, Lila carried two fates within her, the promise of greatness and the burden of sorrow. Her mother, Adana, loved her fiercely, holding her tiny form close and murmuring songs into her ears, songs that told of brave women and patient rivers. Her mother had a laugh that could shake the mango trees and a kindness that spilled over onto every living thing. People said Adana had the heart of the river, always giving, always flowing. Lila grew beneath her mother's laughter, bathed in its warmth like the morning sun that streamed through the round doorway of their hut. But the river can dry and laughter can die. When Lila was just 7 rains old, a fever swept through the village. It crept on silent feet, stealing strength and breath from the old and the young alike. Adana, who had nursed others back from the brink many times, fell victim herself. Lila remembered the way her mother's strong hands weakened, the way her voice, once full and musical, faded to a whisper that barely stirred the air. On the morning her mother's spirit left her body, the village women came with their wailing songs. They wrapped Adana in white cloth and sang her across the river into the arms of the ancestors. Lila sat quietly by the threshold of their hut, her small hands clenched into fists, her eyes dry and hollow. The villagers, busy with ritual and mourning, did not notice the way the wind stirred her hair, whispering words only she could hear. Her father, Bakery, was a proud man, strong and respected among the men of the village. But even pride could not fill the emptiness left behind by Adana's death. For a while he stumbled through his days like a man half-blinded. Lila watched him from the shadows, her heart aching for the father she barely recognized. Tradition, however, left little room for lingering grief. A man needed a woman to tend his home, to weave the mats, to cook the yams, to carry new children into the world. So before the next rainy season, Bakery took another wife, Amara, a woman from a neighboring village. Amara was beautiful in the way a polished stone is beautiful, smooth, hard, cold. She entered Lila's home with the bearing of a queen and a heart heavy with disdain. To her, Lila was not a daughter to cherish, but a reminder of the woman she could never replace. Where Adana had been warmth, Amara was frost. Her words were clipped and sharp, her smiles rare and brittle. Along with Amara came a boy, Cain, her son from a previous union, a boy just a few seasons older than Lila. He was a tall, wiry child with a gaze that shifted and slid away like an eel. At first, Lila tried to befriend him. She offered him her most treasured shell from the riverbank and a piece of her mother's last weaving. Cain accepted her gifts with a crooked smile but gave nothing back. It didn't take long for Lila to understand. Cain had no interest in being a brother. He had come to take, not to share. The shadow Cain cast over Lila's world grew darker with each passing moon. It began with small things. A shove when no one was looking, cruel laughter when she stumbled or spilled her bowl. Amara saw but said nothing. Bakery, busy with his duties and desperate to hold his fragile family together, turned a blind eye. "They are only children," he said when Lila dared to complain, brushing away her fears like flies. But Lila knew the difference between childish squabbles and the heavy, cold coil of true cruelty. By the time she had seen 12 rains, Lila had learned the art of silence. She learned to make herself small, to vanish into the folds of the marketplace crowd or the shadows of the trees. She knew how to listen to the wind for warnings and how to find paths through the forest where Cain would not dare follow. In her solitude, Lila found companionship in the living world around her. At night, when the household slept, she would slip away to the river, its waters singing low songs that wrapped around her ankles like cool hands. Fireflies blinked around her like tiny spirits, and sometimes Lila would sit so still that they would land on her skin, lighting her up like a walking constellation. She spoke to the ancient baobab trees, pressing her palms against their rough bark, feeling the steady heartbeat of the earth itself. She whispered her fears into the hollow stones by the river, trusting that the spirits of water would carry them away. There were tales of river spirits who listened to the pure of heart, and Lila clung to these stories like lifelines. In the language of dreams and forgotten songs, Lila began weaving her own strength, thread by delicate thread. A different kind of fire flickered inside her, not the wild, angry blaze that destroyed but the slow, patient ember that waited, that watched, that learned. The people of the village of Whispering Winds did not notice the girl slipping away from them, wrapping herself in the hidden powers of the land. They saw only a quiet child, obedient and forgettable. But the wind knew. The river knew. And deep in the heart of the earth, the spirits stirred, waiting for the day when the girl born under a weeping star would set the world ablaze. Some say that certain children are born with laughter in their bones, destined to bring joy wherever they go. Others, the elders whispered when they thought no one was listening, were born with smoke in their hearts, restless, choking, always hungry for more. Cain was such a child. From the moment he first set foot in the village of Whispering Winds, the old women paused in their weaving to watch him. His movements were sharp, his voice too loud, his gaze too cold. But when he smiled, the charm of it dazzled like sunlight on a blade. The village men saw his strong arms and fast legs and declared him a blessing to the future of the clan. Such spirit, they said. Such fire. He will be a warrior to fear. They thumped their staffs in approval and turned their faces away from the dark undercurrents that swirled in his wake. In Cain, rage simmered just beneath the skin, a boiling sea barely kept in check. He was a boy who clenched his fists even in sleep, who scowled at the laughter of others as though it were a personal attack. The smaller children learned quickly to step aside when Cain passed, to avoid the sting of his hand or the bite of his words. Yet it was Lila who bore the brunt of his fury. There was something about her that gnawed at him, something he neither understood nor could tolerate. Perhaps it was the way her eyes stayed steady even when he pushed her down into the dust. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which she endured, refusing to break, refusing to scream. Cain hated that about her. He hated the quiet fire that glowed in her chest, a fire he could not snuff out no matter how he tried. He hurt her because he could, because in her silence he saw a mirror of his own emptiness. The villagers, wrapped tightly in their traditions, did not see what grew like mold within the walls of Bakery's house. If they heard Cain's angry shouts or Lila's muffled sobs, they dismissed them with easy words. Children quarrel. They must learn to be strong. And when Lila began to walk with her shoulders bowed and her arms crossed protectively over her ribs, the elders shook their heads and said, "A strong boy is a blessing. His strength will protect us one day." They saw only Cain's broadening shoulders and the way he could run faster, climb higher, fight harder than any boy his age. They applauded when he wrestled others to the ground and did not notice how his eyes gleamed too bright, too cruel. No one asked why the earth sometimes seemed to tremble when Cain was near. Only the very old and the very young felt it, the way the air grew thick, the way the wind held its breath. Animals avoided the paths he walked, birds fell silent when he passed. But the elders, proud of their warrior in the making, chose blindness over truth. And truth was this: Cain was a serpent born in human skin. Inside him, jealousy festered like an unhealed wound. His mother, Amara, fed that wound without knowing it. She spoke often of his strength, her voice swelling with pride, and looked upon Lila with cold disinterest. Cain drank in her favoritism like poisoned water, his hatred sharpening each day. Lila stood untouched by the same rot that twisted inside him. Lila's connection to the land, her way with the fireflies, the river spirits, the quiet sighing trees, only deepened his resentment. She possessed a light he could neither understand nor claim. In the secret spaces of his heart, Cain knew he could beat her, shame her, push her down again and again, but he could never touch that light. And it maddened him. There was another secret too, one buried even deeper, black and heavy as river silt. Cain's father, the man Amara had loved before she came to Bakery's house, had not been a kind man. Stories said he had been cruel and quick to anger, that Amara had fled their home under cover of night, carrying Cain on her hip. Though Cain barely remembered his true father, he carried the ghost of that violence in his blood. It whispered to him when he clenched his fists, when he spat ugly words at Lila, when he dreamed of crushing her light beneath his heel. He had inherited not just strength but a thirst for dominance, a need to be the brightest, the strongest, the one who could not be ignored. And so he hurt Lila not merely out of cruelty, but because in some twisted, broken part of him, he believed it was the only way to survive. The elders, blind in their pride, nurtured the very serpent that would one day threaten everything they held dear. They fed him on praise and ignored the rotting carcass of his soul. A strong boy is a blessing, they said again and again, even when the ground trembled faintly beneath their feet and the sky grew darker than it should have. In the village of Whispering Winds, it was dangerous to ignore the signs. And the winds, ever faithful, had begun to stir more fiercely now, carrying not only the old songs of grief, but the sharp, metallic scent of coming fire. The serpent was growing restless. The girl with the quiet eyes was beginning to burn. The village, too proud or too foolish to listen, was about to reap the storm it had sown. Lila's life unfolded in two rhythms: the heavy, endless cycle of survival, and the quiet, fragile dance of hope that bloomed in secret. Each day began with the same rituals. Before the sun licked the tops of the baobab trees with gold, she was awake. The mornings smelled of damp earth and smoke, and the rooster's cry often blended with Cain's impatient bark for water or food. She moved quietly, learning the art of making herself invisible, floating through her own home like a ghost. The chores never ended. She swept the hard-packed dirt of the courtyard until it shone like polished stone. She fetched water from the river, balancing the heavy gourd on her head while bruises bloomed purple and green beneath her simple dress. She pounded millet with rhythmic strikes, each thud a heartbeat against the silent scream trapped inside her chest. Cain's beatings came without warning, as sudden and inevitable as a summer storm. Sometimes a wrong glance, sometimes nothing at all, a whim, a flicker of anger passing through his blackened heart. The bruises layered over each other until her skin was a secret map of pain. She never cried out. Tears were dangerous. Tears fed Cain's fury. So she learned instead to carry her pain like a second skin, stitched tight around her bones. She wore her suffering like armor, invisible but unbreakable. At night, when the world grew heavy with the hush of sleep, Lila would slip away. Not far, just enough. She had two sacred places that even Cain's shadow could not darken. First there was the old baobab. The tree was a giant, ancient thing that stood alone at the edge of the forest, its trunk wide enough to hide 3 grown men. Its bark was rough but warm, and deep scars in its wood looked like ancient smiles. Some said it was the oldest living thing in the village, older even than the river. To Lila it was a mother, a friend, a guardian. She would sit beneath its sprawling arms, pressing her forehead to the bark, whispering her sorrows into its deep, gnarled skin. The baobab listened. Sometimes, when her voice trembled too much to finish her whispered prayers, the wind would sigh through the leaves, completing her thoughts for her. The second sanctuary was the river of singing stones. By day it was a simple river, its waters clear and swift, its banks crowded with reeds and bright flowers. But at night, when the stars pricked holes in the velvet sky and the frogs fell silent, the river sang. Not in words but in tones, soft, hollow notes that rose from the stones buried beneath the water. The stones hummed and thrummed with the voices of ancestors, of old dreams, of forgotten songs. Lila would sit on the smoothest stone, her feet just touching the cold current, and close her eyes. The river's song wrapped around her, weaving itself into her ribs and her broken places. It sang of sorrow, yes, but also of resilience. Of the way water shapes stone not through rage but persistence. There she could believe, if only for a little while, that her spirit was something Cain could not touch. In those quiet spaces, the land itself seemed to grieve with her. It was subtle at first, the way the leaves of the baobab dulled to a weary gray whenever she wept, the way the fireflies' lights flickered low when her hope guttered. The river would sometimes rise without warning, splashing her toes as if to wipe away her sadness. The villagers noticed how the gardens grew less sweet, how the harvest was thinner, how the animals grew restless, but they blamed the seasons, the rains, the whims of the gods. They never guessed that the heart of the village, the unseen soul tied to Lila's pain, was sickening. Because magic in the village of whispering winds was not the grand, fiery thing of old tales. It was the quiet magic of connection, of heart and soil, of breath and stone. The magic that lived in Lila's blood, in her whispered prayers, in the tears she never shed. Every morning when she returned from her secret places, she would braid her hair tightly and step back into her life of bruises and chores with the same quiet strength. She would answer Amara's cold commands with soft yes memes, dodge Cain's hands with practiced grace, and keep her heart tucked safely inside the folds of her spirit where no blow could reach it. And still she endured. Every day she survived was a quiet rebellion. Every time she chose kindness instead of cruelty, patience instead of rage, she defied the darkness that tried to drown her. The villagers admired her diligence, her modesty, her gentle hands, but none guessed at the battles she fought in the silent spaces of her days. None heard the whispered prayers woven into the beat of her broom, the rhythm of her pestle, the hush of her bare feet on the village paths. But the land heard. The baobab knew. The river sang for her. Lila did not yet know it, but every bruised sunrise, every breath she dared to take was a seed. Seeds that would one day bloom into a fire no beating could ever extinguish. The winds that carried the old songs were beginning to shift, restless and sharp. Change was coming. And Lila, the girl with the quiet eyes and the unbroken spirit, would be its spark. It was a morning like any other, the sky smeared with low gray clouds, the smell of damp earth heavy in the air. Lila moved through her chores with mechanical grace, her mind distant, floating like a leaf on a restless river. The village buzzed with quiet excitement. A visitor had arrived, rare as rain in the dry season. A griot, a storyteller, had come, his arrival whispered from house to house like a secret too precious to shout. It had been years since a griot had passed through whispering winds. Elders tightened their cloaks against the unknown, while children clutched each other, wide-eyed with wonder. Even Cain seemed uneasy, prowling the courtyard with restless steps, as if the very ground unsettled him. At sunset, the village gathered beneath the central acacia tree. Flames licked the dusk in bright tongues as the griot took his place by the fire. He was a small man with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, and his cloak was stitched with the colors of 100 sunsets. His kora gleamed under the firelight, each string trembling in anticipation. He began with the old stories, the ones everyone knew, of trickster hares and proud lions, of clever girls and foolish kings. The villagers laughed and sighed in all the right places, soothed by the familiar. But then his voice dropped, low and secret, and the crowd leaned in. He spoke of a legend not often told, of a girl born under a weeping star, much like Laya. A girl who lived in a village where cruelty hid behind smiling faces, and strength was measured by the bruises one could inflict. The girl, the griot said, did not fight with fists, for fists could be broken. She did not fight with swords, for swords could be stolen. Instead she fought with fire. The girl who dances with fire cannot be burned, the griot intoned, his eyes sweeping the crowd like a hawk. She carries a flame inside her ribs, a fire the wicked fear but cannot touch. Laya sat frozen, the words weaving themselves into her bones. Her heart, so long muffled under layers of sorrow, gave a sharp, painful thud. It was as if the griot spoke directly to her, peeling away her silence, laying bare the ember that had waited, patient and small, at the core of her spirit. For the first time in her life, Laya allowed herself to imagine something outrageous. Fighting back. Not with rage. Not with the same cruelty that Cain used. But with something older, something purer. A fire that could purify, not just destroy. That night she did not seek the river or the baobab. Instead, she stayed in the clearing after the others drifted away, the dying embers of the fire painting her face in flickering gold. She knelt and cupped her hands close to the coals, feeling the breath of heat against her palms. The girl who dances with fire cannot be burned. She whispered the words into the night, tasting them like sacred fruit. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, her dreams were vivid and strange. She dreamed of flames spiraling up from the river, not consuming the water but wrapping it in glowing ribbons. She dreamed of the baobab blossoming with fireflowers, each petal burning without turning to ash. She dreamed of herself, barefoot, hair streaming like smoke, walking through a corridor of fire without fear. When she awoke, she expected fear to curl cold in her stomach, but instead she found only a steady warmth. A readiness. Over the next days, something in her began to shift. It was subtle at first. She no longer flinched when Cain's hand twitched. She met his mocking sneers with an unblinking gaze. She moved through the village not like a beaten dog, but like something fierce hidden beneath plain skin. The baobab seemed to sense the change. Its leaves brightened. Fireflies flocked around her like living sparks. The river sang louder, its stones humming a deeper, braver song. The villagers, bound in their habits of blindness, barely noticed. But the land noticed. The old gods, sleeping in root and river, noticed. And Cain, though he could not name it, felt a crawling unease when he looked at her now. There were still beatings. Still cruel words hissed in the dark. But now Laya was different. She was a flame tucked into a girl's skin, waiting, growing. She began to practice in secret. Not with weapons. Her body was her weapon now, her balance, her breath, her unbreakable will. Beneath the baobab's sprawling arms, she mimicked the way flames flickered and twisted. She trained her feet to be quick, her hands to be steady, her spirit to stay centered no matter how the world tried to snuff her out. She learned to listen, to the river's shifts, to the wind's warnings, to the heavy tremors of Cain's steps. She was no longer a victim moving through the village. She was a whisper of a coming storm. The girl who dances with fire cannot be burned. The griot's words had carved themselves into her, a second heartbeat, a second breath. She did not yet know how or when, but the fire inside her promised one thing. There would be a reckoning. And when it came, it would be her who decided how the story ended. Not Cain. Not her stepmother. Not even the village that turned its head and called it tradition. The next time the wind passed through the village of whispering winds, it carried something new, not just sorrow but a hint of smoke. And it was not the smoke of destruction, but the smoke of something sacred being reborn. The day began like any other, hot and thick with a restless wind that stirred the dust into little devils across the cracked ground. But Laya felt it in her bones, something was different. The baobab's leaves quivered although no breeze touched them. The river whispered warnings she could not fully hear. Even the fireflies stayed hidden as if holding their breath. Cain had been growing more reckless, more cruel. His beatings came harder, his words sharper. Laya had endured, building her fire in secret, letting it grow, letting it wait. That evening, a storm grumbled on the horizon but no rain fell. The sunset burned an angry red, bleeding into the hills. Villagers muttered about bad omens and hurried home. Lila moved through her chores silently, every sense stretched thin. Inside the house, Cain waited. He had been drinking palm wine, his breath thick with it, his eyes wild. Tonight he was more than cruel. He was desperate, as if some part of him sensed he was losing his grip over her, that the fire inside her was close to breaking free. When she entered the hut, he grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her toward the center of the room. His hand raised high, but Lila did not flinch. She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze steady as the river's current. That only enraged him more. He struck her once, twice. She staggered but did not fall. Something shifted in the air, the hut growing unbearably hot, the shadows twisting strangely along the walls. "Not tonight," Lila whispered under her breath, almost too soft to hear. "Not ever again." Cain raised his hand once more, but before it could fall, Lila closed her eyes and summoned every memory, the griot's words, the river's song, the ancient spirit of fire she had dreamed of. From the ground beneath her feet, a low hum rose, deep and resonant, vibrating through her bones. Then came the fire. It did not leap from wood or spark from stone. It breathed itself into existence, coiling around the room, weaving patterns of flame that shimmered like living lace. Lila stepped back, her palms raised, and the fire obeyed, forming a perfect circle around her and Cain. The fire did not burn her. It crowned her. Cain stumbled back, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. He lashed out, but the flames reared up between them, a barrier no blade or fist could cross. The fire was not there to destroy. It was there to reveal. The walls of the hut seemed to dissolve into light. Beyond them the village stirred. The neighbors, drawn by the unnatural glow, spilled from their homes into the night. They gathered, staring, murmuring in fear and awe at the sight. The girl, unburned within a circle of roaring fire, and Cain, cowering like a snake cornered by its own venom. Lila's voice rose, strong and clear, cutting through the crackling air. "See him," she cried. "See what you praised. The strong boy you called a blessing. The one who beat his sister while you turned your faces away." The fire flared in agreement, sending sparks whirling into the night sky. The villagers gasped, their whispers rising like smoke. "Is it true? We never knew. We didn't want to know." Lila stepped forward, the fire parting before her like a living thing. She pointed at Cain, who now trembled openly, his bravado melted away by the heat of truth. "Strength without kindness is rot," she said, her voice heavy with the wisdom of the river, the baobab, the wind itself. "And those who honor cruelty sow their own destruction." The elder council arrived, their robes flapping in the heated air, their faces stricken. Old men who had blessed Cain's strength, old women who had tut-tuted Lila's bruises without protest, all stood silent before the vision of their own shame. The fire, sensing its work nearly done, began to dwindle, drawing inward. But not before one final act. From the flames rose shapes, fleeting visions made of smoke and heat, scenes of Cain's cruelty made visible for all to see. A child weeping beneath a raised fist. A girl hiding bruises beneath her clothing. A village looking away. Each image flashed once, twice, then faded. Cain fell to his knees, defeated not by blows but by truth laid bare. The fire extinguished itself with a great sigh, leaving the air thick with the scent of scorched lies and something cleaner, the possibility of change. For a long moment no one moved. The village held its breath. Then from the crowd a young boy stepped forward, barely more than 10 years old, and placed himself between Lila and Cain. He did not speak, but his meaning was clear. No more. Others followed, young men and women, some trembling, some fierce, until Lila stood surrounded by a silent wall of new protectors. Cain was led away not by force but by the crushing weight of his own disgrace. His stepmother too was pushed aside, her poisonous words falling unheard into the dirt. The elders murmured among themselves, their authority cracked but not yet shattered. Lila stood tall in the middle of the empty circle, feeling the weight of 100 eyes, 100 hopes. She did not yet know what would come next, what battles, what rebuilding, but she knew this. She was no longer a girl of quiet eyes and silent bruises. She was the girl who danced with fire. And she had not been burned. As the villagers dispersed, carrying news of the night's events like embers on the wind, the stars overhead shone brighter than they had in living memory. The ancient forest rustled in approval. Even the river sang louder, as if welcoming a long-awaited return. And the village of whispering winds would never again pretend not to hear the cries carried on the breeze. Morning broke slowly over the village of Whispering Winds, a pale sun rising over a land still trembling from the night before. Smoke from last night's fire lingered in the air, not heavy enough to choke, but enough to remind every breath of what had been revealed. By tradition older than memory, judgment was to take place beneath the great baobab, the ancient tree whose roots were said to touch the bones of the ancestors. It stood at the heart of the village, massive and gnarled, its hollowed trunk wide enough to shelter 5 grown men. Generations had gathered here to settle disputes, bless unions and mourn the dead. Today it would see the village confront itself. The villagers gathered slowly, some still bleary-eyed, others grim-faced. Whispers shivered through the crowd like leaves rustling before a storm. At the center stood Cain, shackled by the invisible chains of shame and fear. He did not meet anyone's eyes. His once proud shoulders sagged. Even his stepmother, the cold woman who had fueled his cruelty, stayed at the edges, isolated, her mouth a tight, bitter line. The elders arrived last, their ceremonial robes billowing, their walking sticks tapping solemnly against the cracked earth. These were the men and women who had shaped the village's laws, who had praised strength and demanded obedience without question. Now they looked smaller beneath the broad arms of the great baobab, judged as much by the people as by the spirits of the roots. At their signal, Cain was brought forward. He stood alone, surrounded by the eyes of those who had once cheered his victories, excused his rages and dismissed Lila's silent suffering. An elder known as Mambo, the oldest among them, whose hair was white as river foam, raised his hand for silence. His voice, though worn by years, carried the weight of thunder. You stand accused, Cain son of Kima, of violence, cruelty and betrayal of the sacred bond of family. Mambo's voice did not tremble, but his eyes were heavy with sorrow. He turned then, addressing not just Cain but everyone assembled. And we, he said, stand accused of seeing and choosing not to see, of hearing and choosing not to hear. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably. Some bowed their heads. Mambo pointed to Lila, who stood nearby, calm and steady as the baobab's trunk itself. Through her courage, the hidden rot was burned away. Through her pain, we are forced to look upon the truth. He motioned for Lila to come forward. The villagers parted like reeds before her, many reaching out to brush her sleeve, to murmur words of sorrow, apology, shame. Lila moved without fear, her head high, her spirit cloaked not in pride, but in the fierce dignity of survival. She stood before the elders, her feet bare against the warm earth, and lifted her chin. Mambo asked her the question that tradition demanded. What is your will, daughter of the village? What judgment do you seek? The crowd held its breath. Lila's voice rang clear in the morning air. I seek no revenge, she said. I seek truth. I seek change. Let Cain answer for his own deeds. Let the village answer for its silence. Let the chain be broken. Here today beneath the eyes of our ancestors. A shudder passed through the gathering. Some wept openly. Others stood frozen, their hearts laid bare. Mambo nodded gravely. He turned to the council of elders. One by one, each laid their hand upon the bark of the great baobab, a symbol of unity and judgment. Mambo spoke. By the laws of our ancestors, by the truth revealed through fire, we cast out Cain from the village of Whispering Winds. Never again shall he raise a hand against blood nor bond beneath our sky. Cain's stepmother cried out, a shrill, broken sound, but no one moved to comfort her. Cain was led to the edge of the village, where the earth grew wild and the trees whispered among themselves. There, he was stripped of his family name, his rights and his honor. A simple pack was thrown at his feet, food and water enough for 3 days, and he was told to walk and not return. It was not death they sentenced him to. It was exile, a far crueler fate for a man who had lived only for the admiration and fear of others. Lila watched without joy but also without regret. She had not fought to destroy him. She had fought to save herself, and to break a curse that had twisted through the roots of their village for generations. When Cain disappeared into the thick green arms of the forest, the village turned back toward the great baobab. Mambo spoke once more. Let this day be carved into our bones, he said. No more shall we honor cruelty in the name of strength. No more shall we turn away from the bruises hidden beneath smiles. No more shall silence be our shield. He placed his hand over his heart. Let this girl, he said, voice breaking slightly, be known as Lila of the fire, the one who did not burn. The one who burned away our blindness. The villagers, one by one, knelt to the ground, not in worship but in respect. The great baobab's leaves whispered overhead, and some said that in that moment, for the first time in many years, they heard the tree sing. Lila closed her eyes and felt the earth shift beneath her feet. The old ways had cracked, and in their place, something new and trembling and powerful was beginning to grow. She did not smile, but a light rose behind her eyes, quiet and fierce. The girl who had endured became the girl who transformed. The song of her fire would echo through the village of whispering winds for generations to come. The days after Cain's exile were heavy with change. The village of whispering winds, once a place where silence had wrapped pain in invisible cloth, now thrummed with something unfamiliar, the tremble of truth finding its voice. Lila did not retreat into the shadows. She did not shrink from the eyes that followed her, wide with awe and guilt and something new, respect. One morning, as mist rose from the river like soft fingers, the elders summoned Lila again beneath the great baobab. The same place that had witnessed her judgment would now become the birthplace of her new life. This time there were no chains of tradition binding her steps. Mambo, the old elder whose voice had been the first to break the silence, stood before her with a staff carved from the heart of the baobab itself. Upon its tip burned a flame, small but steady, fed by a sacred oil known only to the keepers of fire, ancient guardians of the village's spirit. He bowed low, his forehead nearly touching the earth. "Lila of the fire," he said, "we offer you a place among the keepers. A protector, a storyteller, a guide. Not as a servant, but as one who carries the light." A hush fell over the crowd. The title was not given lightly. In the past, it had been reserved for the eldest women, the ones who had endured the storms of many seasons. Never before had one so young, so marked by suffering and strength, been offered the staff. Lila stepped forward, her bare feet brushing the roots of the baobab. She did not hesitate. With both hands she accepted the staff. As her fingers closed around the smooth wood, the flame flared as if recognizing her spirit. The village exhaled in one great, shuddering breath. In the days that followed, new rites were written, old ones cast aside like snake skins too small for the growing spirit of the village. Where once only sons were taught the ways of strength, now daughters were gathered too. Under the great baobab, Lila and the other keepers taught them to recognize the fire within themselves, not fire to destroy but fire to protect, to endure, to illuminate. Stories were told not of warlords and mighty hunters, but of women who healed with song, who held the river's power in their palms, who stood against cruelty even when their knees trembled. Lila, with her quiet eyes and hands strong from years of unseen battles, became a beacon. Children clung to her robes, asking for tales of the night the fire rose. Mothers brought their daughters to sit in her circle of light, whispering prayers of gratitude that their girls would grow up knowing they were not property, not bargaining tools, but flames in their own right. The elders too changed. Slowly, painfully. Like trees twisting toward a new sun. At every gathering, a place was left open in the center circle. A space not for strength or wealth, but for truth. Anyone, even the youngest girl, could step into that space and speak. And the village was bound by oath to listen. It was not a perfect rebirth. Some whispered behind closed doors. Some clung to the old ways like dying vines. But the roots of the change had dug deep, watered by the courage of one girl who chose to fight not with fists, but with the oldest magic of all, the fire of a soul refusing to be broken. One evening, as the last light of the sun kissed the river, Lila sat beneath the baobab, her staff glowing beside her. The village children gathered close and she told them a new story. Not the story of a girl who was beaten. Not the story of a boy who was cast out. But the story of a village that learned to listen. Of a flame that could not be snuffed out. Of a girl who became the keeper of fire, and lit 1,000 more flames in the hearts of those who had once been taught only to endure. The wind carried her words across the fields and into the forests, and it is said that if you listen closely even now, you can hear the fire singing in the leaves. The rebirth of the village of whispering winds had begun, and it would never be silenced again. In the long, winding memory of the village of whispering winds, no tale shimmered brighter than the story of the girl who danced with fire. Lila, born under a weeping star, raised among sorrow and silence, had done what generations before her had not dared. She had refused to bow to cruelty, even when it lived inside the walls meant to protect her. She had fought, not with fists or hate, but with a power older than both, the fire of truth. Before her, the village had been a place of unsung wounds. Whispers lived heavier than songs. Behind closed doors, pain was endured in the name of tradition. Elders, caught in the vines of their pride, had mistaken strength for silence, power for right. And then came Lila, a girl with quiet eyes and bruised hands, who carried the first small flame into the dark. Her defiance was not loud. It was not grand or boastful. It began in hidden prayers, in secret dreams whispered to fireflies, in hands pressed against ancient stones that remembered sorrow. It grew in the spaces between beatings, in the aching cracks of her spirit where most would have planted despair. Lila instead planted hope. And when the time came, when the cruelty became a blade pressed too close, she answered not with brokenness, but with burning. The night she called forth the fire, the night she encircled herself in cane and forced the village to see, truly see, what they had ignored, was the night the village of Whispering Winds changed forever. It was not immediate. Healing never is. But little by little, silence gave way to song. Little by little, secrets withered under the light. Little by little, the village realized that survival was not the highest virtue, that dignity, truth, and justice could not be sacrificed in the name of peace. In time, the paths that once led girls to servitude now led them to choice. In time, boys were taught that strength was not in fists, but in the courage to stand against wrongs, even those committed by their own blood. The village became a tapestry woven from new and old, honoring traditions that lifted the spirit while casting out those that chained it. Each year, during the festival of small flames, the village lit 1,000 fires. Candles flickered on windowsills. Torches lined the riverbanks, dancing with the breeze. Clay lamps nestled in the arms of the baobab trees glowed like fallen stars. Boys and girls walked hand in hand, their faces bright with hope, their steps strong with freedom. They carried no weapons, no chains, only light. And among them, some swore they could still see a shadow moving between the flames, a girl with silver hair and quiet eyes, smiling. Lila had long since passed from the world of flesh and bone. But her spirit, fierce and tender, lived on in every voice that rose against injustice, in every hand that reached to lift another from the dust. She became not just a memory but a promise. A reminder that one small light, bravely burning, could shame the mightiest darkness. The griots told her story to strangers who passed through their lands, weaving her legacy into songs and riddles, dances and prayers. And the travelers carried it beyond the rivers and forests, spreading the legend like seeds on the wind. Other villages, hearing the songs of the girl who danced with fire, looked inward at their own silent wrongs. Other daughters, other sons, felt the stirring of a courage older than fear. And thus, Lila's fire became a constellation across many lands, lights blooming where once only silence grew. For injustice thrives in darkness. And Lila's greatest gift was not merely her defiance, it was her light. A flame offered freely to all who would take it, a flame that said, "You are not powerless. You are not alone. Your light matters." In the village of Whispering Winds, when a child stumbled or wept, when fear coiled tight around a heart, there were always hands to catch, voices to comfort, fires to warm. The lesson was simple but sacred. No light, however small, should ever be dimmed. And whenever the nights grew cold and heavy, when the drums slowed and the stars seemed too far, the villagers would gather around the baobab tree and tell the old, beautiful story once more. Of a girl who lived beneath fists and fear. Of a girl who listened to the river and the trees and the fireflies. Of a girl who called the fire not to destroy but to reveal. Of a girl whose courage became a bridge for generations to cross. The girl who danced with fire. And though her bones returned to the earth, her fire would never die. It would burn in every heart that dared to hope. In every voice that dared to speak. In every step that dared to move forward into the light. Forever and always the legend of Lila lived on, a living flame in the endless wind.